Thank you, gentlemen. It's a pleasure to have our second session of Ecosystem Engage, the expert version. As we know, we're doing a lot of sessions with business leaders and industry leaders and public and governments as well. But this one is really special to me because it's with some of the smartest people I know and some of the smartest people I work with every day. So thank you again for taking the time. The objective of this session really is to talk about the current environment that we're all going through. I think we're all aware of the challenges that we're facing, but then it'd be good to touch upon how is it impacting people, because as we've discussed before as a group, this is more than an economic crisis, which is a fallout. First and foremost, it's a humanitarian crisis, and what it means is that we first have to look after the people, and if people are able to navigate this, businesses will have a better shot at being successful in doing that. So I think what we'd like to cover in this session is the impact on people, how are businesses then coping with this in the current crisis, how is technology enabling businesses to keep moving forward as best as they can, but then also look at what's in store for us in this post-COVID era. What do we expect from a technology standpoint that'll help reshape businesses, will help businesses thrive better, but then also, some of the industries that we believe will need to transform or will have to take the opportunity now in order to be able to pivot themselves and make themselves much more relevant in the current context. So with that, I want to, Klaus, given that you've been probably one of the earliest analysts I've known, definitely from my perspective, the earliest analyst that I know who started covering, social media and the new sort of digital way of working, maybe over a decade ago. That was very, very early days, and you've been tracking that market since then. It'd be great to get your perspective on, what's the impact on people as we see it today, and how are people dealing with this?
Well, people are dealing with it in very different ways, depending on who they are. I certainly know from a few businesses I've been in, larger companies I've been in touch with, that from an HR perspective, they are combating a lot of troubles right now in terms of how people are dealing with the pressure of working at home. I mean, there are people like most of us probably who are just fine because we have types of work that needs us to really sit and concentrate and write. Whereas others are really social animals at work. And a lot of people are finding it very challenging to not be around their colleagues, not to have daily banter at the office, and also just how to manage their workday. I think we're seeing certainly a bleeding out of or bleeding together of private life and work life more than we've done during any time in the last many years. In terms of how people are dealing with it, well, right now we're on Zoom. Everybody seems to be able to figure out how to use Zoom more or less, apart from the etiquette in terms of keeping your microphones on mute, etc., when you have conference calls. But beyond that, the whole idea of working from home and actually being able to collaborate without seeing each other physically is something that's a bit of a strain on a lot of people. Even though we have all the platforms we need to collaborate online, a lot of people just don't really feel comfortable doing that, and they're just not used to it. They need that interaction between people where you can actually just go, talk over the water cooler or have a physical meeting. I'm situated in Denmark. People are meeting animals here. They have meetings all the time. Everything, little issue that needs solving requires a meeting, preferably for an hour, and preferably with 8 people. And all that, of course, is out the window in terms of how easily you can do that. So a lot of people are finding it really challenging. On top of that, of course, we've seen in most countries that we have our kids at home at the same time. And suddenly you have to sort of interact between being a parent, being a tutor, a teacher, and doing your job at the same time. So a lot of challenges that people are finding it very difficult to deal with. personally. Luckily, I've been fine, but it certainly has an impact on people's psychological well-being, and that's something that just shows you, stresses that remote working is fine for short periods of time when it's voluntary, but it's not something that really works for the majority of workers during work life. So companies who perhaps are thinking that this is a viable solution for the majority of their workforce might have a rough wake-up call here.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Look, I think we're all learning lots of new skills, and how to put ourselves out there in the public domain. So, I'm going to take this opportunity to pass this on to one of the newest members of our family, Andrew Milroy. Andrew is not a new face to the analyst world. Certainly not just in Asia, but globally. Andrew has been in senior management roles with some of the biggest analyst firms, but also has worked worked across Europe, the US, and in Asia Pacific, in different parts of Asia Pacific. So, Andrew, I'm going to take this as an opportunity to put this through to you. I mean, in terms of what Klaus was saying from a people standpoint, I mean, what are some of the challenges that are being posed in the current context for businesses and how to deal with it?
Yeah, I mean, I think Klaus covered the people side, very well. And fundamentally, this is a people issue, because we do have technology solutions out there that can address a lot of the challenges that we face. It's just we're using them to a degree we never expected to be using them before, and the particular crisis that we're facing is unprecedented. So I think the main challenge for a lot of businesses is just the scramble to make their people productive, pretty much overnight, making those people productive in a completely different environment. For some businesses, it's actually not possible. I mean, if for somebody who works in manufacturing or some kind of physical role, it's very difficult to make them productive. But in the services sector, banking, insurance, consulting, legal, certain government functions, yes, it's something that you can do from home. And there's been this sudden surge in using certain tools. So the challenge that businesses face is one, making sure that those that can work remotely productively have the tools that they need in place. B, they're trained to use those tools effectively, and C, that those tools have the capacity to enable that work to be done. Because all of a sudden, networks, for example, are being put under enormous strain. All of a sudden, collaboration tools like Zoom are being tested like they never expected to be tested before, pretty much overnight, and all kinds of vulnerabilities are emerging. I mean, that particular solution has been stress tested way beyond how it ever expected to be tested before. But I think fundamentally, people are thinking, how do we just keep going? How do we keep business as usual going as best as we possibly can? And a whole variety of different kinds of challenges are emerging. Many are human and some are to do just with the unexpected pressure being put on the technology solutions that we have.
Just like with those two elements, that some people, it's been forced on them and that's a bit of a shock, and then the technology itself may not be the best experience because it's been stress tested massively. There's that view that this remote working is going to carry on. People are building habits now that they're going to take back into the new normal or the other side of this. But again, the sense there, is there another view that, well, actually, this has been forced on them, it hasn't been the best experience, and they may pull back a little bit from it?
Just to jump in, a little anecdotal comment to that is, the conversations recently with people in the financial services sector, and obviously, they've set people up better than most at home, to work remotely. And what they've kind of universally said is that the productivity is going down. It's very difficult for them to keep the levels of productivity where they want them to be, and they are detecting, people getting frustrated, cabin fever, people having certain issues you'd expect when they're working from home in an environment in a way that they're not used to and they didn't expect.
So negative sort of experience with it.
Yeah.
On the other hand, there's build a new habit, build a new way of working. You need a reason and maybe a prolonged period of time to build that habit into the day-to-day life. So I guess there are still new skills that have been learned.
Yeah, I mean, the outcome will probably be blended, right? So where possible, where it does seem to work, people will work from home to a greater extent, way more than they have been in the past, but clearly not every kind of employee for every kind of function. But I think in future there will be a very significant shift, but it won't be for everybody. It'll be selective.
Yeah,
and I think much more than has been the case before.
To your other point, Andrew, around the setting people up with this. Like I talked to a few smaller companies as well who have had to set their staff up with laptops and do those types of things. A few small law firms who have suddenly shifted things so people could work from home. So there is also just now you have this almost all at once, a lot of people just with the capability to do it now, which wasn't there or present before.
Yeah. And look, I think that point you raised around the law firms, Liam, for example, I think there are certain industries that we know have had very high level of resistance to some of this remote working methods, right? With that, Liam, given that you've been an analyst for over a decade, you've also spent 8 or 9 years in senior strategy roles with a large telco in New Zealand. I mean, what do you see? I guess is the impact on the telecom sector. I mean, I'm sure we hear that telecom suddenly resurging as an industry, but I'm sure it also brings lots of challenges around the network and resiliency and latency and so on.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it is easy to sort of think of this situation, so much going digital, connectivity is such a big part of that the telecom industry is in a great position around this as a sort of immediate thought. And look, it is in a great position when you compare it to the travel industry or transport and things like that. So there is a lot of growth and positivity for that industry as a whole, given that its core underlying offering, connectivity, is in so much more demand and coming back up the sort of mindset of people in terms of being aware of it's important. But there's challenges within it as well, and all of this is causing it to transform a bit too. I mean, on the revenue front, you've got fixed, obviously. You can't make a lot more revenue through this type of situation, but at least the demand's there. But mobile is seeing drops in traffic in various places where things have been locked down, or you've got these circuit breaker measures. Mobile roaming, which is somewhat of a lucrative business for a lot of telcos, has completely died as no one's moving around. And devices as well has always been a fairly chunky area of revenue for telcos, and that's dried up quite significantly too. So there are some immediate sort of impacts to telcos. You've also got the exposure of network performance within them. So you've got exposure of the types of networks that countries may have in place, the fixed broadband infrastructure that can actually support people working from home. I know myself, just working with some software companies through India, get very different experiences depending on the developer that you're talking to and their home connectivity. So that ability for the network to support productivity is really being exposed at the moment. The type of technology, you've got fiber, which is quite synchronous. As people are working from home, it's more of a synchronous type situation. So upstream becomes suddenly a whole lot more important for a home network. And that can be limited on copper networks or some of these other areas. So these types of things are getting exposed. Home Wi-Fi networks, just the quality of that when you're trying to do video calls like this while other people are streaming Netflix. All of these start to show up in people's minds, which can drive to churn or other elements as well. Challenges around just operating and build. Managing all this bandwidth growth, needing to suddenly invest capex and backhaul and other areas. OPEX or in backhaul in other areas, CapEx and some of the equipment, needing to bring some of that forward, while at the same time building out new networks like 5G become that much harder for a lot of telcos. Even just your customer service, given that your call centers in other countries and are having their environments change. So there's a lot of sort of immediate challenges and opportunities in the industry, but I think back to some of the conversations earlier around changes in people's behavior, changes in the way people work, they have the implications for how the industry may transform a bit moving forward. And it's really trying to understand what might be a blip in that behavior versus what's more sort of long-term change. So take remote working. People are set up to be able to work more remotely. People are more used to these types of collaboration tools and everything that they might have at the moment. You start taking that back into the enterprise when people go back into the office. People are going from their 50 meg through to a gig connection at home that they've had for themselves, and then they're going back into the office, and if they take a lot of this activity, it's going to put a lot of strain on the enterprise network, and enterprise IT teams are going to need to start sort of rethinking that space. So it may start to accelerate shifts from sort of legacy enterprise networks through to some of these more newer technologies, SDN, NFV, these types of things that can be cost effective and provide agility, start to potentially just get a lot more mind share and traction in the market than and speed up their adoption than maybe has been seen before. Then you also, even in the communication platform as a service type space, if everyone's out there sort of digitizing a lot of their engagements and B2B activity or customer engagements, it starts to produce opportunities for that market. And it's up to telcos to see, are they going to get overridden again like the OTTs did, or do they have a role to play within that space, and are there new wholesale type opportunities?
Just picking up on something Liam said here in terms of people coming back to work, and suddenly the bandwidth is not what they're used to. We actually saw the same pattern happening 10, 12 years ago when a lot of companies were still on lease lines with perhaps 1 meg that was to be shared with amongst all workers doing their broadband, whereas when they went home, they had DSL, which would give them a much better connection. And that certainly pushed a lot of companies to upgrade their connectivity. I think certainly the lesson from Europe is that in terms of bandwidth and capacity, the networks have kept up really well. The telcos have been able to cope with demand, probably because overall demand is not that much larger than when the world works normally. It's just a different type of traffic, and of course there's more media traffic. What has helped in Europe is that companies like Netflix have downgraded the quality they stream in. They no longer stream in 4K to subscribers who subscribe to that, but only do HD. And that has helped some of the bandwidth issues with local telcos as well.
Yeah.
One other thing I think though, and that's the idea that some companies have had to issue laptops to their remote workers now. Some of the things we've seen across the world, even in the US, or particularly in the US, for example, is that there are actually quite a few families who don't have bandwidth, who don't have the technology at home to be able to do remote learning or connect in decent ways with their friends and family. And we've seen that especially in poorer, typically Black communities in part of New York and other places in the US, that once the schools closed, they had a large pool of pupils who did not have access to broadband and did not have access to laptops in order to do remote learning. And I think this crisis has highlighted that there still are pockets of inequality, even in the Western world, where people actually don't have access to broadband.
Yeah, I think there's like from a regulatory standpoint, a lot that can then be looked into again off the back of this in terms of the setup of the country's environment or telco industry. Digital divide absolutely comes up and has been really highlighted through this. not just connectivity, but as you say, the other devices, the actual know-how in order to use those. Certain sections of the population being left behind. So a lot of short-term fixes happening through the crisis. Like in New Zealand, I think Chorus gave 50,000 households free broadband, or at least free wholesale broadband, so that they could do education and learning from home. But that's a short-term fix. The longer term, what are the plans around helping to close this digital divide? Because things like this happen again in the future, it becomes another sort of utility that everyone should really have access to good quality broadband.
I just want to shift gears quickly, because all of this remote working, I mean, one of the things that we've seen in the last 4 to 6 weeks is just the huge uptake of Zoom. I mean, I like Zoom. It's really easy to use, but there's been lots of talk around security breaches. And I mean, that is just what we see as lay people, as laymen in the media, right? But there must be lots and lots of other security implications that businesses are opening themselves up to. It's like a can of worms, right? So I'm going to just pause and pass this on to, Alex Wandel, who's been a long-term cybersecurity practitioner and an expert who brings a very personal element of the story into his mission to enable stronger measures for businesses around cybersecurity. So, Alex, do you have any sort of thoughts around that?
Yeah, there's certainly been a pretty significant impact on security as an industry, but also obviously the security posture of organisations. A couple of challenges have come out of this in a very quick succession is one, the rapid deployment of digital transformation projects. Suddenly, where there was maybe a 12 or 18 month or a 2-year plan to move to cloud, it's been rushed overnight. So suddenly, the traditional network perimeter, which we've been talking about for so long, that the perimeter's dead, long live the perimeter. That's sort of coming to fruition overnight, and suddenly we're shifting our data into the cloud en masse. And given the nature of the environment that we're in at the moment, security is almost an afterthought. For accessibility, continuing operations in a remote working capacity first and foremost. Security is sort of hanging onto the coattails, trying to keep up and do what they can to try and harden those environments. But we're certainly seeing, a reactive approach to security. The other thing that impacts security at the moment is in this sort of environment, we see a heightened attack environment. People preying on vulnerabilities, preying on the situation we're in, the fact that people may let their guard down a little bit, click on a link in an email, not realizing that it's malicious. I think there was a report coming out of the US that the FBI said that since the lockdowns or since the pandemic was sort of announced, there's a 400% increase in reports of security incidents or security attacks. So we're seeing security teams sort of stretched at the moment. There's been long talk of skills shortage within the sector, but we're seeing security teams stretched both from a security operations perspective, trying to deal with events, but also trying to keep up with rapid transformation of major networks, of corporate networks and environments into sort of cloud-first strategies. On top of that, you've got a whole bunch of other things that I think security teams traditionally have worried about, but they've been able to control. And things like, from working from home, suddenly the whole hardware piece comes into play. People are using their own computers because the organisations may not have been ready to deploy laptops to all of their workers, so they're giving remote access to home computers on home networks, which they have no visibility or control over. In an environment where we're starting to see, particularly in Australia, we're seeing a lot of stand downs. We're seeing obviously some pretty high unemployment, growth in unemployment, rapid retrenchments across industries. Insider threats become a real issue. So monitoring for data loss becomes a real challenge for organisations, particularly in those situations where you've got personal computers. You may not been ready to roll out mobile device management, endpoint management for those sort of devices. So you've got a whole range of security threats, as well as just ordinary business as usual requirements for security, all compounding into almost a perfect storm to make the environment extremely challenging. So what we're seeing is where there's obviously some industries that have been really impacted negatively by this. I think security on the flip side, is seen, it was already overstretched as an industry globally. We're starting to see it even go multiple times beyond that. So what that creates is gaps, and it creates significant threats because organisations are deploying very quickly with limited security controls or limited security consultancy built into that. At the same time, a lack of resources and a lack of ability to respond. So the threat landscape at the moment is massive, if it wasn't already before. So it's really an interesting time for security, and it'd be interesting to see what that mid to long-term impact will be. I think what we'll see is a bit of a catch-up in sort of the next 12 to 18 months, where a lot of security teams will be focusing on going back over cloud environments and hardening and looking at supply chains and focusing less on necessarily internal pen testing and vulnerability management, more on baselining cloud platforms, establishing the right access controls for cloud environments, focusing on protecting stuff that's out in the cloud rather than protecting stuff that's inside a network. I think that's probably going to be the biggest shift that we'll see, where it'll be an overnight sort of shift and lift to that focus, where it was probably more split in the past. The other thing that we'll see is with constrained, as a result of the economic impacts of this, with constrained budgets for a lot of industries and a lot of organisations, a lot of security vendors, there's been a massive growth in security vendors over the last few years, and a lot of them have got that traditional sort of model of selling you a piece of kit or a license on a 2, 3, 4 year term. It's hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars. That shift towards consumption or managed security services type models will be a real focus, I think, in the next couple of years. Again, one, for lack of being able to get skills, and secondly, for lack of just being able to fork out a massive upfront fee for some kit. So we'll certainly see some significant impacts to the security industry, not just the immediate impacts, but I think over the next 2 to 3 years, it's going to change the landscape quite dramatically.